Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Real Canadian Liberal Podcast again, where we look at things from a liberal perspective. We're talking about that collectivist, totalitarian nonsense that gets called liberalism these days. We're talking about real liberalism, based in egalitarian universalism, the idea that everyone is equally intrinsically valuable and has certain inalienable human and civil rights as a result of that, and all of the social and economic philosophy that surrounds that idea. And I'm your host, Stu Staudinger. I'm a retired British and Canadian military officer. I'm an applied scientist and conservation/regenerative rancher right here in central Alberta. And this evening I want to talk to you about something that I've mentioned a couple times before. I'm talking about industrial concentration. And its effect on things like wealth inequality and the fact that it isn't representative of a free market economy at all. And I got triggered onto this, discussing this again by watching a video Russell Brand put out. I watched it a while ago, but I figured we should maybe have a look at it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a bit of his video and let you guys have a look at it, and then talk through it a little bit so you can get an idea what he's talking about. It's a video that he has. It's about the Great Reset, billionaire philanthropy, tax avoidance, stuff like that. But I'll play it. Just a short clip, and then we can talk about it.
They won't use it.
The Gates have already committed to giving 95% of their wealth away. Warren Buffett, 99%.
What do they mean by that? Are they actually going to do it? Do you think they're actually going to go, right, I had 100 quid, now I've got a quid. The rest of it I've given away. No, it's going to be this skullduggery, isn't it? We moved the 99 quid there, then we moved it there, then we moved it back here. I still got it!
They say that kind of extreme giving is needed because the rich have been getting so much richer. Tech innovations and rising global markets have produced vast fortunes not seen since the Industrial Revolution.
There's this terrible problem with capitalism. These elites have risen to the top, create these sort of uber-powerful figures that have got much more money than everyone else combined. Who should we turn to create a solution for it? Them? No! Not them. We've seen what they do already. The 40...
Right, okay. I've enjoyed watching Russell Brand for a while now. I don't agree with him on a lot, and a few years ago I would have agreed with him on even less. He's a kind of an old school socialist in some respects, but you know what? He's 100% right. He just misses a couple points, and that's why I wanted to bring this up. He says the problem with capitalism is he's not talking about capitalism at all. This is called corporatism. Corporatism and capitalism are two different things. You see, first off, a corporation, generally, there are a few privately owned corporations, but a corporation, the name comes from the idea of corporate ownership, right? i.e. it's a collective. It just happens to be a non-state collective. So, I don't know, you could take a colony of people. People live in a little communist colony or whatever, but they have a factory and they build widgets, right? And they have a corporation that sells widgets. Guess what? They're a communist collective, right? Operating as a corporation. That's what a corporation is. It just happens to be a corporation outside of the state sector. It's not public sector. And we in Canada, because we got constitutional monarchy, we call publicly owned corporations crown corporations. But a corporation is a corporation. It is not privately owned. It's publicly traded for the ones that are out there. Now, does that mean that you can't have corporations within a free market? No, it doesn't. But what it means is you have to keep an eye on industrial concentration. That's the problem. When we're talking about wealth inequality, it's driven by industrial concentration. It's nothing to do with capitalism, right? The Chinese are not capitalist. They're corporatist. They're a national socialist, and yes, they are a national socialist corporatist economy, right? That's what they are. People talk about communism. The Chinese are not communists. They're national socialists. They have almost identical social and economic structure to Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. Fact. Look it up. Have a look. Tell me one significant difference between the two. They're the same thing, right? Corporatism is also the primary economic structure of fascism, which is subtly different from National Socialism. Won't go into the details right now. people refer to them pretty much as the same thing, but they're slightly different. Anyway, the point being, corporatism is a collectivist economic model unless you have sufficient antitrust legislation and it is applied properly to ensure that no corporation achieves more than X% of market share. And then, so you're forcing the economy into a position where you have competition. There are enough companies in a particular market sector that you have competition creating a free market. And what that does is it increases the market power of labor, the market power of supplier, and the market power of consumer, and reduces the market power of the corporation itself. This is why corporate economies and socialist economies create the biggest wealth inequalities. Because they put the market power in the hands of the corporation. It doesn't matter whether it's a public or private sector corporation. Because it is a collective organization and it doesn't have to respond to labor requirements or consumer requirements or whatever, because it's the only game in town. It doesn't innovate. It pays labor what it wants to, not what labor needs or wants or negotiates for. It pays suppliers what it wants to, not what the suppliers actually need or want out of their product. And it forces the customers to pay whatever the customers want because they got no choice. There's no choice on either end of the chain. That's called corporatism. I'll use give you a couple of illustrations. Agriculture in North America is a particularly bad example of how this has gone horribly wrong. There are 4 beef processing companies that control 85% of North America's beef processing. 4. It's a cartel. A beef rancher doesn't have a choice, effectively, doesn't have a choice what he sells his beef for unless he markets direct to his customer. Because the big corporations effectively set the prices and they pay what they're willing to pay. And the rancher has no option to pick up the phone and phone 15 or 20 other companies and negotiate a better deal and say, hey, I'd like an extra 10 cents out of X, Y, or Z. It doesn't work. And at the other end, here's an example. I think it's Tyson Foods in the US. They have 14 different pork labels. Used to be independent companies, all competed with each other. They've all been bought out by one company. They still have the labels. A consumer walks into a grocery store and sees different labels. There's the illusion of choice. They're owned by the same company. It's the same pork. It's processed in the same factory. It probably has the same spices in it, right? You buy a package of sausages. It's the same thing. It just has a different label. They make one a little bit more expensive and pretend that it's the premium line. There's nothing. It's all owned by the same company. It's the same thing. There is no choice. It's the illusion of choice. You can't say, oh, we'll buy this product, and because they're whatever, consumers pushing the market. Consumers aren't pushing the market. It's the same company. Same company will sell you whatever they want, just in different packages. And this is the problem we have. In 1950 in the US, the average CEO earned 20 or 25 times what the entry-level worker earned. Well, companies were a bit smaller then too, so that made a difference. But the point is, 20 or 25 times. By 1990, that was like 200 to 250 times, something along those lines. And now it's like add another 0. Right? Every 30 years we've added 0, effectively. Because round about the late 70s, from 1979, they stopped enforcing their Sherman antitrust legislation, which means companies were able to buy out and create monopolies, oligopolies, or even cartels within certain market sectors. It's happened all over the economy, and it's all over the Western world. It's not so bad in Germany or whatever. Scandinavian countries are fairly strong in maintaining a free market, oddly enough. High tax, but still free market. But most of the world is now controlled by big corporations. As Russell mentioned in his video in another place, as of the year 2000, 51 of the top 100 economies on Earth weren't national economies, they were international, multinational corporations. This is a problem. It is a problem because wealth inequality is driven by industrial concentration. It's not driven by politics. It's not driven by whether you have a socialist or a capitalist economy or whatever. Right? I guess it does. It's driven by industrial concentration. And industrial concentration is an effect that you get in a socialist economy. It's an effect you get in a corporatist economy. It doesn't matter whether the corporate ownership of a particular market sector is public or private. If it is a corporately owned monopoly, oligopoly, or something like that, where the market power resides with the corporation, private or public, you end up with massive wealth inequality because they don't have to respond to supply chain demands, and they don't have to respond to labor demands, and they don't have to respond to customer demands because there's no choice for the suppliers or the labor or consumers. They've got it's a one-stop shop. Competition's gone. So what happens? Prices go down on the front end and up on the other end, and the money flows up. That's how it happens. And because of this COVID-19 lockdown, everything else, governments have clamped down all the small business. They're destroying the middle class, right? Rather than expanding it, they're destroying the middle class. And the money's flowing up. Because consumers have no choice who they get X, Y, or Z product from. They're reducing the choice. And because those companies control both ends, they control the supply end and they control the consumer end, and the consumer has no choice, their profit margins go up, and all that profit goes up to the top. People talk about wealth distribution. Oh, we just take their money and just spread it out. Well, that's what Russell's talking about, because a lot of them are avoiding tax while they're at it. And yes, we need to stop some of that shenanigans. But they don't need to pay more tax than everybody else. They just need to pay their tax. But what they also need is we need to stop this industrial concentration. Governments need to clamp down on this industrial concentration. They need to throw antitrust legislation, break up these biggest companies, reduce barriers to entry at the bottom of each market sector, and get more competition there. If you have 10, 15, 20 companies operating within a particular market sector, now labor has something to negotiate with. When they have a skill set, they can go to 2, 3, 4, 5 companies and say, hey, this is me, this is my skill set. And they can get an appropriate salary for their skill set, rather than just being gouged by the one company in the market. Same for suppliers. They can phone around, they can get a good deal. They can force the corporation to negotiate. Consumers, same thing. They can walk into the grocery store and they can pick between labels that are actually competing with each other and force them to sell products for a reasonable price. That's what needs to happen. Jonathan Tepper wrote a really good book about this back in 2018. It's called The Myth of Capitalism. I recommend everybody read it. It's a really good, really covers the subject really well. And he talks about how Adam Smith, when he wrote Wealth of Nations in the late 1700s, he was arguing against corporatism, mercantilism, which is just corporatism directed by the crown. But anyway, the point is he was arguing against corporatism. He was arguing against monopolies, duopolies, oligopolies, cartels. He was railing against this, the concentration of capital within market sectors. Because when you concentrate the capital in too few hands, those hands, inevitably, it's like power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's always happened. It's always been a feature. That's what Wealth of Nations is about. Read Wealth of Nations. Right? I'd recommend you read it. Right? Most socialists would understand what he was talking about. They'd go, oh, hang on. Yeah, he was arguing about the same thing we're arguing about. Without even knowing it. The free market is the only way that you put market power back in the hands of labor, suppliers, and consumers. Because otherwise, socialists will say, oh, let's put it all in the hands of the government. Government owns everything. Great. So you take a competent corporatist economy and turn it into an incompetent corporatist economy. You still have huge market concentration. You still have wealth inequality. It happens everywhere. Massive wealth inequality in China. Massive wealth inequality in the US. Corporatist economy, corporatist economy. One's a totalitarian one, one's supposedly a democracy. It doesn't matter. It's all down to industrial concentration. Also, if Russell does see this, Russell, call Jonathan Tepper. Get him on your show. Have a talk about this stuff. I think you and he would find some pretty good common ground here. You might disagree on wealth redistribution type stuff, but you certainly agree on where the problem is. And I would really, really love to see that conversation and see the to and fro there. So give them a call. You guys could rip into this stuff, right, for a good half hour and entertain a lot of us and also inform a lot of people, because let's face it, modern education system teaches virtually zero history and zero economics, which is why nobody knows what Adam Smith actually talked about. And nobody knows what corporatism is. And no one knows that socialism is just public sector corporatism. So, talk to Jonathan Tepper. Get him on your show. Talk about his book. Talk about these ideas. More people need to know about it. And I will come back to this. It's very important. It's hugely important for our society, for the benefit of everyone else around us, to ensure that people start to understand where wealth and inequality comes from, because it's a big problem. And throughout history, there's only been one real solution, and that has been to put market power back in the hands of labor, supplier, and consumer. And the only system that has ever managed that is a true free market. And it takes government intervention from a point of view of antitrust legislation to make that happen and to keep it where it needs to be. So, I'll leave that with you. Have a think about it. Get Jonathan Tepper's book. Borrow it, whatever. Get it from the library. Read it. It's a good book. Talk about it. And Russell, I like your work. I love your pragmatic, sarcastic way of looking at the world. And thanks very much, all. And we'll see you on the next video.